third one this week.
This is the third one this week.
This is not ordinary.
It is a curse.
Stay away. What a shame.
Come closer, little ones, and listen. For the ancient trees hold the stories of our people. Let the light of the past rise up and show you the wonders of our story.
This is the third one this week.
This is the third one this week.
This is not ordinary.
It is a curse.
Stay away. What a shame.
They found the third dead goat behind my hut on a Tuesday morning, and by Friday, the whole village had already decided I was going to burn. Before that week, I was just a woman with a husband who loved her, a mother-in-law who tolerated her, and a womb that refused to fill. By the end of that week, I was something else entirely. A curse with legs, a shadow wearing a woman's face. They called me Iya Aje, witch mother. The irony of it still sits bitter on my tongue, because the one thing every single person agreed I was guilty of, barrenness, was the one thing I had no power over at all. My name is Nkechi. But before you decide you know how this story ends, before you assume this is just another sad tale of a woman wronged by her village, I need you to stay with me. Because nothing about what happened in Amudo that year was as simple as it looked. There was a reason those goats died. There was a reason children in that village had started falling sick one after another. And there was a reason, a very deliberate, very human reason, that all of it landed on my doorstep instead of where it truly belonged. If you love a story that twists when you least expect it, stay close. Don't scroll past this one. And if this is your first time here, tap that subscribe button now, because where this story is going, you will not want to miss it. Let me take you back to the beginning. Back before the accusations, back before the fear, to a season when I still believed my biggest problem was simply that I could not give my husband a child. I married Obiara when I was 19. He was the kind of man other women in Amudo whispered about with jealousy, not because he was wealthy, he wasn't, but because of how he looked at me, like I was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. His mother, Mama Ijeoma, did not share his enthusiasm. She had wanted a different bride for him, a girl from a bigger compound with more goats and more land, a girl whose family could bring more to the marriage than laughter and a strong back for farm work. But Obiara chose me, and for the first 2 years of our marriage, I let myself believe that love was enough to silence any mother-in-law. I was wrong, but I did not know it yet. By the third year, when my belly had still not swollen with a child, the whispers in the market began. Small at first, a pause when I walked past the cloth sellers, a too long stare from the woman who sold peppers, the one whose own daughter had 4 children before she turned 25. Mama Ejelma stopped pretending to be patient. She would sit outside our hut in the evenings, grinding pepper with more force than the task required, muttering things just loud enough for me to hear through the thin walls. "A tree that does not bear fruit is only good for firewood," she said one evening, not looking at me, as if she were speaking to the wind. Obiara would apologize for her on nights like that, holding me close, telling me children would come when the gods decided it was time. He believed it. I wanted to believe it too. But there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from carrying a longing your own body refuses to satisfy, month after month, year after year, while everyone around you treats your emptiness as a moral failing rather than a private grief. I carried that loneliness the way some women carry firewood, bent under it but too proud to let anyone see me struggling. What I did not know then, what I would only discover much later when the truth finally cracked open like a overripe fruit, was that my body wasn't entirely to blame. Someone in that village had made sure of that. but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it started, because the way it started is the reason nobody suspected anything for a very long time. It began with Ngozi. Ngozi was my husband's cousin's daughter, a bright girl of 7 who used to follow me around the compound asking questions faster than I could answer them. She was the closest thing I had to a child of my own, and I loved her the way you love something you are terrified of losing. One evening in the dry season, Ngozi came down with a fever so sudden and so violent that her mother's screams woke half the village. By morning, the fever had broken, but something in the girl had changed. She stopped speaking. She would stare at walls for stretches, flinching at sounds only she could hear. The village healer, an old man named Baba Uzo, examined her and declared with the calm certainty of a man who had never once been wrong in public that this was not sickness of the body, this was spiritual. Someone had done this to her. And who, the village wanted to know, would want to harm a sweet child like Ngozi? I remember the exact moment the question turned toward me. It was at the stream, 2 days later, where the women gathered each morning to fetch water and exchange news faster than any town crier could manage. Adaora, a woman known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory, said it first, dressed as concern rather than accusation. "Is it not strange," she said, filling her pot slowly, deliberately, that Ngozi fell sick only 3 days after she refused to greet Nkechi at the market? The child said Nkechi's eyes looked strange that day. Cold, she said. I was standing right there. I heard every word, and I watched with a growing dread I could not yet name as the other women's faces shifted from sympathy to suspicion in the span of a single sentence.
I want you to notice something here because it matters for everything that comes later. Adora was not simply gossiping. She was planting something. And if you're paying attention, you'll start to wonder, just as I eventually did, why Adora, of all people, was so quick to point a finger in my direction and so quick to know exactly which details would make the accusation stick. But at the time, I only felt the ground shifting beneath me, and I had no idea how to stop it. The rumors grew the way termites grow in a rotten log, quietly, invisibly, until the whole structure is hollow and ready to collapse. Within 2 weeks, 3 more children in Amudo had fallen ill with symptoms similar to Ngozi's. Fevers that came and went with no pattern, silence where laughter used to be. One boy, little Chidi, was found wandering near the edge of the forest at midnight, unable to explain how he got there or why. Not long after, a girl named Adaize stopped eating for 3 days straight, staring at nothing, and a boy named Emeka began waking screaming in the night, unable to say what had frightened him. Baba Uzo consulted his oracle and returned with grim news for the whole village. A witch walked among them, feeding on the innocence of children, and this witch had a grudge, a deep and personal grudge against the families whose children she attacked. It did not take long for someone to notice that every single affected child belonged to a family that had at some point shown kindness to me. Ngozi's mother had once given me yams during a difficult harvest. Chidi's father had helped Obiora repair our roof. Adaizi's mother had sat with me for 3 nights the year I nearly died of malaria, feeding me broth spoon by spoon until I could stand again. Emeka's father had given us seed yams the season our own harvest failed. The pattern once suggested seemed to confirm itself in everyone's mind, the way a shape in the clouds becomes obvious once someone points it out to you, even if it was never really there. Nobody asked why a woman desperate for a child of her own would attack the children of people who had shown her kindness. Nobody asked why, if I had such power, I had not simply used it to give myself the child I wanted more than anything in this world. Fear does not ask good questions. Fear only asks who is easiest to blame. And I, by every measure Amudo cared about, was the easiest woman in that village to blame. Childless, an outsider's daughter, since my own mother had come from a village 3 days' walk away. Quiet, in a place where quiet women are assumed to be hiding something, while loud women are simply assumed to be honest. every trait that had once made me merely unremarkable now made me suspicious. Obiora fought for me in those early weeks. He stood in the village square and reminded everyone that I had nursed Ngozi through fevers before, that I had wept for 2 nights when Chidi went missing, that no woman capable of such love could also be capable of such cruelty. But love, I learned, is a poor shield against fear, especially fear wearing the mask of protecting children. The more Obiora defended me, the more people began to whisper that perhaps he too was under my spell, bewitched into blindness by whatever dark power I commanded. Even his own mother turned the knife deeper. Mama Ijeoma, who had never wanted me in her family to begin with, found in this crisis the perfect vindication of every doubt she'd ever harbored. "I told you," she said to Obiora, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "A woman who cannot bear children is a woman with something wrong inside her. I did not know it was this kind of wrong, but wrong is wrong. If you think you know where this story goes from here, the mob, the fire, and the tragic ending, I promise you, you don't. Because the truth of what was happening in Amudo was far stranger and far more calculated than simple village superstition. Someone was orchestrating this. And before this story is over, you're going to meet that person and you're going to understand exactly why they needed me to burn. But we're not there yet. Stay with me because the middle of this story is where everything starts to unravel." 3 weeks after Ngozi fell ill, the village council called a formal meeting. This was not the usual gathering under the Odara tree where minor disputes were settled with raised voices and eventual laughter. This was serious. Elders from 2 neighboring villages were invited to witness. Baba Uzo prepared his shrine with unusual solemnity, and I was told, not asked, to appear before the council to answer for the sickness spreading in Amudo's children. Obiora walked beside me that morning, his jaw tight, his hand gripping mine so hard it hurt. I remember the walk to the square felt longer than any walk I had taken in my life, though it was the same path I had walked 1,000 times before. The compound gates, the dusty road past the blacksmith's shed, the bend near the old well where children usually played, but where that morning there were no children at all, only silence and staring adults. The square was packed. I had never seen so many people gathered in one place, not even during festivals. Every face I searched for kindness gave me none. Even women I had shared laughter with at the stream, women whose babies I had held, looked at me now as though I might sprout claws at any moment. Baba Uzo stood at the center, his ceremonial staff planted firmly in the dirt, and began to speak in the slow, deliberate cadence he reserved for pronouncements he wanted remembered. "The spirits have shown me a woman," he said, "whose womb was closed by her own hand in exchange for power over the children of others. This woman walks among us." A murmur rolled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. I felt my knees weaken, but I forced myself to stand straight because I understood, even in my terror, that showing weakness now would be read as guilt. "Baba," Obiora said, stepping forward before anyone could stop him. "With respect, you have not named her. You speak of a woman who could be anyone. Why does the village whisper my wife's name and no other?" It was a bold question, the kind that could easily have angered the old man in front of the entire village. But Baba Uzo only smiled, thin and unreadable, and turned his gaze to me. "Let her step forward and let the shrine speak for itself." What happened next is the part of this story that still gives me chills even now, even knowing everything I know today. I was made to kneel before the shrine, a collection of carved wooden figures, cowrie shells, and a small clay pot filled with a dark liquid I did not recognize. Baba Uzo instructed me to drink from the pot, a ritual meant to reveal guilt or innocence. If I was truly a witch, the liquid would supposedly burn my throat and cause me to confess. If I was innocent, I would feel nothing at all. I want you to imagine that fear. Not the fear of pain, though that was there too, but the deeper fear of a system designed to fail you regardless of the truth.
I did not know what was in that pot. I did not know if it was harmless water dyed dark or something genuinely dangerous mixed by a man who had already decided my guilt before I ever knelt before him. I drank it anyway because refusing would have been read as confession, and confession meant death. The liquid was bitter, sharp, but it did not burn. I felt nothing beyond the natural fear coursing through my body. I looked up at Baba Uzo, waiting, praying for this to be the moment the village finally saw the truth. Instead, the old man's face twisted into something I could not immediately read, and he announced, in a voice that carried to the very edges of the crowd, that my lack of visible reaction was itself proof of my power, that a witch strong enough to bewitch 4 children would certainly be strong enough to mask the shrine's judgment. There is no version of that test I could have passed. I understand that now. I understood it somewhere deep down even then. But understanding a trap does not help you escape it once you're already caught inside. The council did not sentence me to death that day, though I could feel how close the crowd came to demanding it themselves. Instead, they gave me 7 days. 7 days to somehow prove my innocence, or 7 days before Amudo would decide what to do with me permanently. Obiora begged for more time. Mama Ijoma, to everyone's shock, said nothing at all, not in my defense and not against me either, which frightened me more than if she had simply condemned me outright, because silence from a woman who had never once held her tongue felt like its own kind of warning. That night, lying beside Obiora in the dark, neither of us sleeping, he finally asked me the question I could see he had been carrying for weeks. "Nkechi," he whispered, "is there anything at all that you have not told me?" I understood why he asked. Fear does strange things to trust, even love as strong as ours. But I also understood in that moment that if my own husband could hold even a sliver of doubt about me, I had exactly 0 chance of convincing a village that had already decided to hate me. "I have told you everything. I have nothing to hide because I have done nothing." He believed me. I know he believed me because the next morning he did something that changed the entire direction of this story, though none of us knew it yet. He went alone to speak with Ngozi's mother, hoping to learn more about exactly what happened the day the girl fell ill. And what he learned there cracked the first small hole in a wall that had seemed until then completely solid.
Before I tell you what he discovered, let me pause here for a moment. Because I promised you this story would not be simple, and I intend to keep that promise. If you're finding yourself curious about where this is heading, if you want to see exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes, make sure you're subscribed. Because trust me, the answer is more shocking than anything you're imagining right now. Now, back to Obiora, standing in Ngozi's mother's compound, asking careful questions about the day her daughter first fell ill. Ngozi's mother, a woman named Chidinma, was hesitant at first, understandably protective of her still fragile daughter. But Obiora had known Chidinma since childhood, and eventually she softened enough to walk him through that day in detail. Ngozi had gone to the stream that morning with a group of other children. She had eaten roasted corn from a vendor near the market. She had played near the old baobab tree before coming home in the early afternoon, already complaining of a headache. It was a small detail, the roasted corn, that caught Obiora's attention, mostly because he remembered something odd. The vendor who sold roasted corn near the market that season was new. She had arrived in Amudo only a few months earlier, claiming to be a widow from a village further south looking for a fresh start. Her name was Uzuamaka, though most people simply called her Amaka. Obiora asked carefully whether any of the other sick children had also eaten from that same vendor's stall around the time they fell ill. Ngozi's mother's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't thought of it before, but yes, she remembered Chidi's father mentioning that the boy had bought roasted corn just days before he went missing near the forest. And now that she thought harder, Adaize's mother had mentioned buying corn from that same stall too, and so had Emeka's older sister, the very afternoon before his screaming began. Every one of them, Chidinma said slowly, realization dawning on her face even as she spoke. Every single one of them
ate from her stall. Here is where I need you to slow down with me, because this is exactly the kind of detail that separates a real mystery from a lazy one. A new woman arrives in the village, out of nowhere, with a story no one had thought to question. Every single sick child had contact with her stall in the days before falling ill. That was not a coincidence anyone in Amudo had noticed yet, because no one had ever had a reason to look for one. She had access, she had opportunity, and she had an alibi built entirely on the assumption that nobody would ever suspect the sweet corn seller everyone had grown fond of in just a few short months. Obiora came home that evening with something he had not carried in weeks: hope. He told me everything Chidinma had shared, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the smallest flicker of possibility that the truth might actually find its way to the surface before Amudo decided my fate for me. But hope, as I would soon learn, is a fragile thing in a village already convinced of its own conclusions. The next morning, Obiora went to the elders with what he had learnt, hoping they would agree to investigate Amaka the corn seller before my 7 days ran out. He was met instead with something close to hostility. Baba Uzo, in particular, dismissed the theory almost before Obiora finished explaining it. You would accuse an innocent widow new to our village struggling to build a life for herself simply because your wife stands accused? The old man said, his voice sharp with something that, looking back now, sounds far more like defensiveness than genuine skepticism. This is desperation, Obiora, not evidence. It should have been a reasonable objection, except Obiora noticed something strange in that moment. Baba Uzo knew without being told that Amaka was new to the village and described as a widow, details Obiora had not actually mentioned in his explanation. Small slip, easy to miss if you weren't listening carefully, but Obiora was listening very carefully indeed, because his wife's life depended on it. That night, Obiora did something bold, something that could have gotten him in serious trouble if he had been caught. He went to Amaka's stall after dark, not to confront her, but to watch. He wanted to see who came and went, who she spoke with when she thought no one was paying attention. And that is how he saw Baba Uzo slip quietly into Amaka's small compound just after midnight, staying for nearly an hour before leaving as silently as he had arrived. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I certainly had to sit with it when Obiora told me. The village's most trusted spiritual authority, the very man who had declared me a witch before the entire community, was secretly meeting in the dead of night with the one person whose stall connected every single sick child. This was the moment everything I thought I understood about my situation turned completely upside down. This was not simple superstition. This was not fear feeding on itself the way rumors sometimes do in small, frightened places. Someone had built this accusation on purpose, brick by careful brick, and I was standing exactly where they wanted me to stand. But why? What did Baba Uzo and this new widow possibly gain from destroying my life and sickening innocent children in the process? The answer, when it finally came, was so simple and so human that it made the whole elaborate cruelty of it even harder to accept. Obiora and I had 4 days left before the council would decide my fate. 4 days to somehow prove a conspiracy that powerful men in our village had spent weeks constructing. It felt impossible, but Obiora, bless him, refused to accept impossible as the final answer.
He returned to Chidinma the next day, and this time he asked a different question. Not about the children, but about Amaka herself. Where exactly had she come from? Who had vouched for her when she first arrived in Amudo? Chidinma thought for a long moment before answering, and what she said sent a chill straight through both of us. Now that you ask, she said slowly, I remember Baba Uzo himself introduced her to the council when she arrived. He told everyone she was a distant relative of his late wife, seeking a peaceful place to rebuild and grieve. A distant relative of his late wife. Not a stranger who wandered into Amudo by chance, but a woman personally brought into the village, personally vouched for by the same man now leading the charge to have me condemned as a witch. If your mind is racing right now trying to connect these pieces, you are exactly where I was standing at that moment, and I promise you, the full picture is still darker than you are imagining. Obiora, driven by something between desperation and fury, decided there was only one way to get real answers before our 4 days ran out. He would confront Amaka directly, not with accusations, but with careful, patient conversation, the way you might approach a frightened animal you are trying to understand rather than trap. He found her the next afternoon, alone at her store during the quiet hours between market rushes. He bought corn he didn't want, made small talk about her life before Amudo, and slowly, carefully steered the conversation toward Baba Ozo. At first, Amaka gave the same rehearsed answers everyone in the village had heard before. Grieving widow, fresh start, grateful for Baba Ozo's kindness in welcoming her, but Obiora noticed her hands trembling slightly as she spoke, the roasted corn forgotten on the fire behind her, and he made a decision that could have ended badly for him. "I know you are not simply his late wife's relative," he said quietly, gently, no accusation in his voice, only a kind of desperate honesty. "My wife is going to die in 4 days for something I do not believe she did. If you know anything at all, I am asking you, woman to man, mother to husband, please help me." Amaka went very still. And then, to Obiora's shock, she began to cry. The truth came out slowly, in pieces, the way truths often do when someone has been forced to hold them in silence for too long. Amaka was not Baba Ozo's late wife's relative at all. She was his daughter, a daughter born outside his marriage, hidden for years to protect his standing as the village's spiritual authority, a position that demanded, above all things, moral purity in the eyes of Amudo's people. Baba Ozo had brought her to the village under a false story, giving her a small piece of land and a modest trade, but the arrangement went far beyond simple family loyalty. Amaka, it turned out, had been trained by her mother, a woman skilled in the use of herbs, both healing and harmful, before her mother's death years earlier. Baba Ozo had asked his daughter to use that knowledge, not to harm the children permanently, but to create exactly the kind of mysterious, frightening illness that would require his intervention as the village healer, restoring his reputation after a string of failed treatments the year before had begun to erode the community's trust in him. I remember Obiora telling me this part with his voice shaking, because even he could barely believe what he was hearing. Baba Ozo's authority had been slipping. 2 harvests earlier, his predictions failed spectacularly. A drought he swore would not come, a sickness among the cattle he claimed he could prevent. Whispers had begun, quiet ones, about whether Amudo needed a younger, more capable healer. Baba Ozo, terrified of losing the position that had defined his entire life, needed a crisis only he could solve, and a villain dramatic enough to make his solution unforgettable. And who better to cast as that villain than a woman already whispered about for her empty womb? A woman whose own mother-in-law had spent years planting seeds of doubt about her worth. I was, in the cruelest possible sense, the perfect character for the story Baba Ozo needed to tell. The herbs Amaka used caused fevers and temporary confusion, frightening but rarely dangerous if managed correctly. And managed correctly they were, always by Baba Ozo himself, arriving just in time to heal each child through rituals that were in truth nothing more than time and rest doing what time and rest naturally do. Every recovery he reinforced his power. Every recovery deepened the village's fear of the witch he claimed was responsible. But here is the detail that broke something open in me completely. The detail Amaka delivered through her tears with something that sounded almost like a relief at finally releasing it. Adaura, the sharp-tongued woman from the stream, the first person to publicly suggest my guilt, was Baba Ozo's cousin. She had known from the beginning exactly what her family member needed, and she had planted that first seed at the stream not out of genuine suspicion, but as a favor,
A small piece in a larger design none of the other women gossiping beside her had any idea they were helping build. And there was one more piece, the piece that explained the cruelest detail of all, why it was specifically my womb's emptiness that made me the perfect target.
Years earlier, before I ever arrived in Amudo as Obiara's bride, there had been a brief, complicated history between Baba Uzo's late wife and my own mother back in the village where I was born. A dispute over land that Baba Uzo's family had lost, a dispute my mother's family had, according to the old stories, won through means some considered less than honest. Baba Uzo had carried that resentment quietly for decades, waiting, watching, and when his old friend's son Obiara brought home a bride whose mother's name he still remembered with bitterness, he saw not a young woman starting a new life, but a debt finally within reach of collection. My childlessness wasn't the reason he chose me. It was simply the weapon he found most convenient to use once he had already decided, years before I ever set foot in Amudo, that I would eventually pay for a debt that was never truly mine to owe. I sat in stunned silence when Obiara finished telling me everything Amaka had confessed. All those months of fear, all those nights of praying my body would simply do the one thing everyone expected of it. All of it had nothing to do with my worth as a woman, and everything to do with an old man's wounded pride and an even older grudge I hadn't even known existed. We had 3 days left, and now, finally, we had the truth. But truth alone is rarely enough to move a village that has already decided what it believes. We needed proof, and we needed Amaka willing to say all of this in front of the same council that had nearly condemned me to death. This is the part of the story where I need to be honest with you, because Amaka's willingness to help us was never guaranteed. She was terrified of her father, of the village's reaction to her own role in this, of a future with nowhere left to belong if the truth came out. Obiara spent the better part of that evening convincing her that silence would only entrap her forever in her father's shadow, while truth, however frightening, might finally set her free. It was Amaka herself who suggested the plan that would finally break Baba Uzo's carefully constructed lie in front of the entire village. 2 days before my sentencing, a 5th child in Amudo fell mysteriously ill, a boy named Uche, son of one of the village elders. This time, though, Amaka refused her father's instruction. Instead of the usual herb mixture designed to create temporary mysterious symptoms, she gave the boy nothing at all. His fever, caused by nothing more than an ordinary childhood illness that had nothing to do with any of Baba Uzo's schemes, lingered exactly as ordinary illnesses do, refusing to respond to the old man's usual dramatic rituals. For the first time in months, Baba Uzo stood before a sick child and had absolutely no idea what was actually wrong with him, because for the first time, nothing was actually wrong with him beyond an ordinary fever any village healer should have recognized immediately. His confusion, visible to everyone gathered anxiously around Uche's sickbed, planted the very first public seed of doubt about his abilities. It was into that seed of doubt that Obiara, Amaka, and I walked the following morning, one day before my sentencing, requesting an emergency audience with the full council. I will never forget the way Baba Uzo's face changed when his own daughter stepped forward in front of the elders and the gathered crowd, no longer hiding behind rehearsed stories about grief and fresh scars, and told them exactly who she was and exactly what her father had asked of her. The square, which had been so loud with condemnation weeks earlier, fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heart beat. Amaka's voice shook as she spoke, but she did not stop, not even when Baba Uzo tried twice to interrupt her, his own composure cracking in real time in front of the community that had trusted him completely for as long as most of them could remember.
She told them about the herbs, about the timing of each illness, always conveniently followed by his dramatic intervention, about Adora's role in planting the first accusation against me at the stream, and finally, with tears streaming down her face, about the old land dispute between our families, the grudge her father had carried silently for over 2 decades, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity to finally settle it. Mama Ijeoma, standing near the front of the crowd, made a sound I had never heard from her before, something between a gasp and a sob, because in that moment she understood, along with everyone else in Amudo, that the daughter-in-law she had spent years treating as less than worthy had never been guilty of anything beyond the simple, painful misfortune of a body that would not do what everyone demanded of it. Baba Ozo tried to deny it at first, his voice booming with the same authority that had once been enough to convince an entire village of my guilt without a single piece of real evidence. But authority built on lies collapses quickly once the truth finally has room to breathe. And one by one, the elders who had trusted him for decades began asking questions he had no honest answers for. Why had he never once tested the theory that the illness might come from something the children ate or drank before immediately declaring witchcraft? Why had every single healing ritual occur only after his own private meetings with Amaka? Why had he introduced Uzoamaka to the village under a story that once examined even slightly fell apart within minutes? By the time the sun set that evening, the council had reached a decision entirely different from the one they had been preparing to announce against me just 24 hours earlier. Baba Uzo was stripped of his position as village healer, a role his family had held for 3 generations, and banished from Amudo alongside the very daughter he had tried to use as a weapon against me. Amaka, to her credit, chose exile without complaint, understanding perhaps better than anyone that whatever future she built now would have to be built somewhere entirely new, on foundations more honest than the ones her father had given her.
Adaora faced her own reckoning too, though a gentler one, since her role had been smaller and her guilt, while real, was tangled up in loyalty to family, rather than the deep personal malice that had driven Baba Uzo's actions. She was made to publicly apologize before the entire village, a humiliation she endured with far less grace than Amaka had shown, but a fair consequence nonetheless for the seed of poison she had so casually planted at the stream that morning. As for me, the woman who just 1 day earlier had been preparing to face whatever punishment Amudo's council decided to hand down, I stood in that same square, surrounded by the very people who had so recently been ready to condemn me, and I felt something far more complicated than simple relief. Vindication, yes, relief, certainly, but also a grief I had not expected, for the months of fear I could never get back, for the friendships that had turned to suspicion the moment fear demanded a target, for the reminder, sharp and lasting, of exactly how quickly people I had known my whole life were willing to believe the worst of me simply because I did not fit the shape of womanhood they expected. Mama Ijeoma came to me that evening, alone, without the sharp words she usually carried like ammo. She did not apologize in so many words, that was never her way. But she took my hands in hers, something she had never once done in all our years together, and she said quietly, "I was wrong about many things, Nkechi. I hope you will let an old woman try to be better." I would like to tell you I forgave her instantly and completely, that the months of cruelty simply melted away in that one tender moment. But that would not be honest, and I promised you this story would not insult you with easy, tidy endings. What I can tell you is that I let her hold my hands and I did not pull away. And in the months that followed, slowly, imperfectly, something between us began to heal. There is one more piece of this story I have not yet told you, one final twist I have been saving because I think you have earned it after staying with me this far.
6 months after Baba Uzo's banishment, I finally understood why my body had refused to give Obiora and me the child we wanted for so long. It was not witchcraft, obviously, you already know that. But it was not simple misfortune either, not entirely. When the new village healer, a kind and careful woman named Uju, who arrived to replace Baba Uzo at Obiora's gentle insistence, she discovered something Baba Uzo, in all his years pretending at wisdom, either missed entirely or simply never bothered to properly investigate. A treatable condition, common enough in women my age, requiring nothing more mystical than the right herbs and patience. Within a year, I was carrying a child, a daughter, born the following spring, and I named her Amarachi, meaning God's grace, because grace was exactly what had found me when I least expected it, in a season when I had almost stopped believing it ever would. I think about Amudo often, even now, years later, with my daughter old enough to ask me questions about the scar this story left on our family's history. I think about how close an entire village came to destroying an innocent woman, not because they were uniquely cruel people, but because fear is patient, and fear is clever, and fear will always find someone convenient to blame when the truth feels too complicated to face directly. I think too about Amaka, wherever she ended up building her new life, carrying the weight of choices she made under her father's shadow, but also carrying the courage it took to finally step into the light and tell the truth when it mattered most. I hope she found peace. I genuinely do. And I think about myself, the woman I was before all of this happened, and the woman I became after. Someone who learned in the hardest way possible that the stories a community tells you are not always the truth about who you are. Sometimes they are simply the truth about what that community is most afraid of, dressed up in your face because you happen to be standing in the wrong place when they needed someone to blame. If you have ever been misjudged, misunderstood, blamed for something that was never truly your fault, I hope this story reminded you of something important. The truth has a way of finding daylight, even when it feels buried too deep to surface. It may take time, it may take courage from people you never expected to find it in, but it comes. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath through every twist, do me one favor before you go. Subscribe so you never miss the next story like this one, and tell me in the comments, at what point did you first suspect Baba Uzo? I want to know if you saw it coming or if this story surprised you exactly the way I hope it did. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I will see you in the next story.